China, China, China. China is one of the biggest threats to United States national security. They're also trying to encroach globally and even beyond planet Earth into space. But for all that China is doing to advance itself, it is actually encountering some economic difficulties, which should be reasons either for joy or for concern, depending on how you look at it. We're going to get into what is happening to China economically today, and we will also be discussing what does this mean for the future. But first, let's talk about why we should care about this issue in the first place. As I mentioned, China poses one of the biggest threats to American national security. Let's go through a few examples to illustrate just how much. During the Cold War, when the United States was battling the Soviet Union over a capitalist world view versus a communist worldview, the United States did everything that it could to try to prevent Soviet infiltration into our society. Now, some may argue that at times Americans took this too far, with the McCarthy hearings, which were accusing many members of our government of being communists. In some cases, that was true. We did have people in our government who were communists, but at other times it was just frothing up this Red Scare. But still, it shows that back then, we really took it seriously to not have our adversary have a hand in our dealings. Fast forward to 2023, we are in a new Cold War, this time between us and another communist power, China. But the difference is that now we are totally letting this new communist threat encroach into our daily domestic lives. Let's look at education. Since 2004, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has funded more than 100 Confucius Institutes on United States college campuses. The State Department labels these Confucius Institutes as, quote, a foreign mission of the People's Republic of China to, quote, push out skewed Chinese language and cultural training for United States students as part of Beijing's multifaceted propaganda efforts. In addition to these Confucius Institutes, China is also sending an enormous amount of Chinese students to become educated in American universities, come back home to China and tell the CCP all that they learned about the way that American universities do things, and it is also a way to try to get China to have more of a presence in the United States by sending such a high volume of students. According to ICE data from 2020, the United States awarded more than 350,000 foreign visas to Chinese students alone. That is incredible, and that is many times more than the second and third place countries, which are India and South Korea. So we give an enormous amount of foreign visas to Chinese students. Again, we are really kind of letting this encroachment happen and making it much easier for China to do so. Let's go on to farmland purchases. The Chinese Communist Party purchases an enormous amount of farmland here in the United States. Conveniently, farmland that is located next to sensitive military installations. According to a 2021 report by the United States Department of Agriculture, China owns more than 384,000 acres of farmland in the United States. In 2022, for example, a Chinese company bought farmland that was located about 20 minutes away from Grand Forks Air Force Base, which, according to CNBC, is, quote, home to some of the nation's most sensitive military drone technology, and it serves as, quote, the backbone of all United States military communications across the globe. Nothing shady to see there, right? Just as there was nothing shady to see when when China sent a spy balloon to traverse over the United States and spend an extra amount of time over Montana, where we have a lot of those military bases. By the way, our president, Joe Biden, said in recent weeks that China didn't mean to send that balloon. He said China didn't really know what it was doing. It was more of an embarrassing mistake than anything else. China knows exactly what it is doing. Every single step they take, word they say, move they make is highly calculated. Let's look at fentanyl. Fentanyl is the #1 cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. Where does fentanyl come from? It is made and manufactured in China. China sells it to Latin American drug cartels, which are funneling it across our southern border at record rates. Also, according to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, there are a lot of Chinese nationals that are surging across our southern border as immigration restrictions are increasingly becoming more and more lackadaisical. Intellectual property theft, yet another point here in the list of all the ways that we are letting China encroach into the United States. It is estimated that China steals between $1 and $2 billion of intellectual property from the United States annually. According to our FBI director, Christopher Wray, quote, "The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property, to our economic viability and vitality, is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China." Another way that China is stealing property for their own benefit from us, this is not intellectual, but it is military property, is what we are seeing in the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal. In August of 2021, just about 8 months into Joe Biden's presidency, he decided to very rapidly pull United States troops out of Afghanistan after 20 years of U.S. presence there. Literally within hours, the Taliban, the very power that we had fought for 20 years to get out of Afghanistan, came right back into Afghanistan. That means that $85 billion of American military equipment that we gave to the Afghan people in hopes of equipping them to fight the Taliban themselves went into the hands of the Taliban. Now, China is very closely aligning with the Taliban, and actually what is going on is that the Taliban is sending this American military equipment to China so that China can refashion it and look at the way that we design our military technology for their own benefit. China, again, more on the list, and it could go on and on and on. I'm actually just keeping it to the footnotes here. They hacked into government emails just about a month ago. Top U.S. government officials' emails were compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. They opened a spy base on the neighboring country of Cuba in 2019. This spy base's existence was not revealed to the American people until 2023. Again, conveniently, they opened the spy base on Cuba because it happens to be about 90 miles off of the shore of Florida. And in Florida, in places such as Miami and Key West, we have very significant military bases and installations. The U.S. Pentagon announced that China has recently surpassed the United States in their number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and killer satellites in outer space. And China also just announced recently that they are planning to open a jointly manned moon base alongside Russia by the year 2036. They expect to start construction on this jointly manned moon base in just 3 years. And then finally, again, could go on and on and on, but keeping it short here, finally, the Chinese Communist Party has outsized influence in United States media. According to the latest filing under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, Chinese Daily, which is an English language media outlet that's controlled by Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda department, this China Daily, I think I said Chinese Daily, excuse me, it's called China Daily, spent about $1.2 and $5 million in advertising dollars that they paid to major Western publications, such as USA Today, Time Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, the Houston Chronicle, the Seattle Times, and the Chicago Tribune. Just as a quick note, President Biden, in a visit to China in 2011, made this comment, quote, "Let me be clear. I believed in 1979 and said so then, as I believe now, that a rising China is a positive development, not only for the people of China, but for the United States and the world as a whole." President Biden, then Vice President Biden, also said on that same trip in 2011 that he, quote, "fully understood and was not second-guessing China's one-child policy," which, among other things, led to forced abortion and infanticide, especially of young Chinese girls. So now that we have an understanding of how grave of a threat that China poses to the United States, how we are letting them infiltrate into our institutions. Oh, and by the way, another way they're infiltrating into our institutions is that CCP officials have actually paid the Biden family, our President Joe Biden, as well as his son Hunter Biden, millions of dollars. So nothing to see there. But now that we understand the threat that China poses, let's look at what's going on with their economy, because this could change things. A diminished economy for China could make them into a lesser power and perhaps could stop or at least mitigate this ever-encroaching influence in the United States. China in recent months has seen weakening exports, a real estate slump, and a sluggish consumer spending economy. So let's go through each of these. Weakening exports. According to a July report here in the United States, exports in China had the sharpest year-on-year decline since before 2020, before the COVID-19 pandemic. Another gift from China. Imports have also had 5 straight months of declines. In the first half of 2023, China's share of United States imports fell to the lowest level in 20 years. So the United States is looking to sell to other countries besides China. Also, the United States has turned to Mexico, Canada, Europe, and other parts of Asia in order to get imports. They no longer want to solely rely on China for chips, electronic parts, and toys. The United States is trying to diversify from whom it buys. China accounted for 13% of all U.S. good imports during the first 6 months of 2023. That is about half of the number that it was in 2017. That number was 21.6%. This shift, people are saying, really started in 2018 when President Trump was in office and he slapped tariffs on Chinese imports, which made it more difficult for United States citizens to buy from China. It was for that very reason, to disincentivize us from buying from China. But also, the Biden administration recently issued an executive order which banned United States investments in certain Chinese companies, semiconductors, and quantum computing. And also, there is a general corporate American reaction to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, at least to a lot of Americans, seems to be a lot more volatile than previous Chinese leaders. He was very strict with the COVID lockdowns in China, and then all of a sudden he lifted those restrictions as there were more people in China who were fighting against him. He is trying to change things economically in China to make it harder for United States businesses to use Chinese workers. So again, there is this shift that American business people are trying to enact away from China to diversify their business in other countries, especially in other Asian nations such as Vietnam, Thailand, and India. So that is the story with regard to diminishing imports and exports in China. Another thing that I mentioned was that there is a real estate slump in China. Land sales in China make up approximately a third of total revenue for local governments, because in communist China, the government owns almost all the land. So anytime there's a land sale, it's going to go right into the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party. And so what's happening is that the CCP used to subsidize a lot of developers to build apartment buildings, build malls in on land in these more rural parts of China. But the problem is you can pay people to build an apartment all you want, but what we're seeing in China is that there are a lot of apartments that are empty. People are not moving into them. People are not going to the malls and buying products for the malls. And so what the Chinese Communist Party has had to do is give those developers money, subsidize those developers, even though their projects did not make any profits. And so as imports and exports are slowing, as there is this sluggish real estate situation, the CCP increasingly doesn't have as much capital, as much money to bail out these real estate developers. They are hoping that Chinese citizens will make up for this loss by engaging more in the economy. But the problem is a lot of people in China are seeing that the economy is slowing, so they are not as likely to spend money, but spending money is exactly what they need in order to keep the economy going and to be revitalized. So it's this vicious cycle. That's what we see in a lot of times of economic downturn. The very thing that is causing the problem, that is lack of consumer spending, is the very thing that would remedy the problem, but it just continues and continues. The unemployment rate in China for young people aged 16 to 24 is especially low. It is at an especially high, forgive me. It is at an all-time high of 21.3% as of June of 2023. This statistic is actually from China's National Bureau of Statistics. But since they released that stat saying that youth unemployment is at an all-time high, they just a few days later retracted it and forbade Chinese state media from talking about or republishing that report. By the way, that unemployment rate, 20% for Chinese young people aged 16 to 24, excludes rural residents. So it is probably, some say it may be even double. It may be 40% youth unemployment because they're not accounting for literally millions of young people who are not living in cities in China. So to expand out and make a global comment about this economic downturn, let's figure out, why is it happening in general? The answer is quite simple. It's that communist state-planned economies don't work. We saw it in the Soviet Union, and now we are seeing it in China. It looked for about 2 to 3 decades like China might have been able to succeed at having a state-planned economy. This is for a few reasons. First, China enacted this program, which is sort of hilariously named Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. The Chinese characteristics basically means capitalism. So they have shifted away from an absolutist socialist economy, as was seen under Mao Zedong, for instance, in China's earlier history, and they have allowed some foreign investment, some consumer spending, what they call Chinese characteristics, capitalism, to supplement the socialism. So that certainly helped things for some time in China. Also, China has a huge population. They have 1.4 billion people. India, in recent weeks, actually just surpassed them as the most populous country in the world. So they had a huge workforce to draw on, which kept them forward. And China has also been very efficient in their manufacturing, very technologically advanced. They have been a hospitable place for foreign businesses to come to because there are no economic environmental regulations in China. There's no labor regulations in China. They don't make companies have limits on the amount of greenhouse gases they emit. They don't exclude child labor, for instance. So it's unfortunately a lot of big, especially American companies like Apple, have gone in and take advantage of the fact that they don't have to abide by the same standards that they do in the United States. So for about 2 to 3 decades, it seemed like China was going to succeed at this socialism with Chinese characteristics. They became the second biggest economy in the world, second only to the United States. But again, now we are seeing that China is reaping the bitter harvest of having a centrally planned economy. It just doesn't work. Because really, to make it simple, everything economically that happens in China only happens if the CCP allows it to happen. That is totally antithetical to a capitalist economy where you can, with some, government approval or, regulations that you have to fulfill, you can open any business you want. You can hire people who you want. You don't have to check in with the government to do that. That is totally different in Chinese in the Chinese Communist Party. If you want to open a business, you've got to get permission from the government. They have to keep very close track of what you are doing. They very much control who you hire. They take a huge portion of your profits, and a lot of the times this involves bribery. So you can really only open a business in China if you bribe the right CCP official. China only allows private ownership as long as you are in good standing with the party. But that is not capitalism. Even bailouts is fundamentally, inherently anti-capitalistic, because in capitalism, you take on risks. Your business may boom, your business may fail. So by China totally controlling the economy, who engages in it, also being very willing to bail people out, their industries out if they don't work, that has created this sluggishness, because fundamentally the Chinese economy is anti-free innovation. It is control. And it makes sense that the CCP has enforced this economic control, because if you have economic freedom, you have political freedom. If you are controlled economically, then you are going to be controlled in other ways. So that is the way that they keep a stranglehold on their populace. Before we move on to other issues facing China and what this may mean for the future of China and its interactions in the world, let me quickly tell you about MyPillow. I use all MyPillow products, and that is not an exaggeration. I walk into work every day wearing my slippers because they are very comfortable. I go home and I use my towels. I sleep on my pillow, and I use the Giza Dream bed sheets. And you can use all of these at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name, Hartman. For a limited time, you will get 60% off of the Giza Dream bed sheets. This comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99 if you use the promo code Hartman. And on top of that, when you make a purchase for this limited time, you will get Mike Lindell's soft cover book free with the promo code Hartman. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square, or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. On top of these economic struggles that China is facing, there is a huge demographic issue that they are also facing, which is fueling, in part, these economic issues. As aforementioned, India recently surpassed China as the world's most populous nation. China has about 1.4 billion people, and India has nearly 1.5 billion people. The reason for this demographic issue is because of the one-child policy, which President Biden said in 2011 that he totally understood and wasn't second-guessing. The one-child policy was enacted in China from 1979 to 2015. It mandated that Chinese families could only have one child because at one point they were worrying about overpopulation. What happened is that a lot of Chinese families would have one child and they would make sure that that child was a boy. If a girl was born, it was just so awful. Babies would be aborted at 9 months in the womb with these forced abortions. They were thrown into garbage cans only to be rescued by overwhelmingly American adoption centers. There was a large number of infanticide. And so what happened is, fast forward to 2023, China has an overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly older population. The problem is if there are too many males than females, then it's not going to be very easy for women to procreate. And we're seeing an inversion from the old policies in China, where now China is actually begging people to have multiple children. They are subsidizing in vitro fertilization so that their populace will procreate. China's total fertility rate, this is the average number of women a woman has in their lifetime in China, is 1.09 as of 2022. This is down from 1.3 in 2020. This is according to the National Health Commission. 2.1 is needed in order for China to keep its population stable. Remarkably, the fertility rate in China is lower than even Japan's. And Japan is an extremely primarily older, demographically slowing population. The median the average number of babies in China that a woman would have in 2022, as I said, is 1.09. In Japan, it's 1.26. The median age for a Chinese citizen is 39 years old. That is a decade older than the median age of a citizen in India. China's population is actually, on average, much more rich than the average citizen in India. For instance, the per capita annual income in 2022 of an average Chinese citizen was $12,000. In India, it was about $2,000. Also, China's population is far more literate than India's population. Only about 75% of India can read. This is a number that China surpassed several decades ago. But still, India's population is ever growing, and India is really trying to rectify these problems of poverty and of a lack of literacy. So China is feeling very anxious about the fact that India may be not just their economic, but demographic rival. This was compounded even more because today, India actually landed on the south pole of the moon. They were the first power to do so. I talked about this in a recent Julie Noted. Russia tried to get to the south pole of the moon. Their rocket or object that they wanted to land crashed into the moon. It failed. India's successfully landed. So given that Russia wants to have a jointly manned moon base by 2036, they are probably not so happy that India has already come in and set up shop on this part of the moon that is not very much known about or explored. So what does all of this mean for China and the world? Their economy is slowing down. They have this big demographic issue. Is it more likely that we will be able to combat Chinese infiltration into the United States and Chinese global hegemony? Well, it's a little bit more complicated of a story than that. When an economy slows down, in any country, but especially in a dictatorial country such as China, that's going to lead to a more discontented population. We saw in China that there were these historic protests against Xi Jinping's draconian COVID lockdown rules. These protests happened at the end of 2022, and that made Xi Jinping change his policies and reopen the economy. So we see the Chinese population, despite the fact that you can literally get killed for speaking out against the regime, is expressing more of a willingness to challenge the regime. And with this economic slowdown, they may be more likely to do that. This is what happened in the Soviet Union. Increasingly, the populace became more discontented with the horrible economic state. But the difference is that China saw what happened in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Xi Jinping specifically is very determined to not have that happen. So he really looks closely at what happened in the 90s and making sure that it is not replicated. The Soviet Union also did a lot of, frankly, stupid things that China has deftly avoided. For instance, the Soviet Union pursued all of these international campaigns. They invaded Afghanistan famously to try to bring communism beyond the Soviet Union, beyond the constituent Soviet socialist republics into other countries. And as we know, unfortunately, in the United States, invasions are very economically costly. China has done things way differently. They know. They've seen the way it worked out for the Soviet Union and for the United States. They don't go in and invade other countries. They may do that with Taiwan, but at least up to now, what they do is they actually make other countries accomplices in their own demise. China goes into countries like Iran, like Hungary, like Chile, like Colombia, and say, hey, we're going to, economically invest in you. We're going to build railway lines. We're going to invest in infrastructure. But as my dear mother says, nothing in life is for free. And that is the case with the CCP. If the CCP is offering to do you a favor, there are strings attached. And the strings are that if China ever acts out, those countries are now bought off and they cannot react to Xi Jinping's encroachment. So maybe more likely to see more protests in the population, but what is actually probably the more likely outcome is that China may grow more reckless. If they think that their population's unhappy, if they think that they are economically in a really bad state, they may think, well, what do we have to lose by invading Taiwan? Let's do something reckless. Let's make a big statement and try to recoup our losses in another way. So this may make it more likely that they will invade Taiwan. Some in the United States has said that maybe they would consider invading the United States, which people may laugh at listening at home, but clearly they are very forceful with going into other countries and setting up shop. But here's the thing, from China's perspective, why would they waste their manpower and their money to invade in the United States? They already have a foothold here. As mentioned, they have infiltrated into almost all of our institutions. We in the United States allow the CCP to stay in power and get stronger militarily because we not only don't fight against their encroachment, but we reward them by letting them bring in Chinese students. We rewarded them in 2001 by admitting them to the World Trade Organization. We rewarded them in the 1970s when we recognized the People's Republic of China as the main legitimate government of China, and by doing that, we gave the United Nations Security Council seat to Communist China. It had previously been given to the nationalist government set up by Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. Americans we're discrediting ourselves because we're getting so woke. Our public schools are a joke, they're a disaster, and so we're allowing our own decline. And what is that doing? That is making other countries see China as a replacement of the United States as a global power. People are starting to look to China for international leadership. We saw this where China brokered a historic peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Those countries hated each other prior to 2023, but China came in and tried to bring them closer together. China has said that they want to be the one to negotiate the end of the war in Ukraine. So we're basically allowing this to happen. The United States could take better advantage of these economic difficulties in China and use it to our advantage. Let's hope we're smart enough to do so. Thanks for joining me. I hope this was interesting and informative to you. Hit the subscribe button down below if you like this video and you would like to see more news as well as timeless content, and I'll see you soon. Take care.